There comes a moment in every connection where the person who once ran from intimacy begins to speak a language they never dared to learn, a language of truth, vulnerability, and transformation. When the avoidant says this, you are no longer a stranger knocking on a closed door. You are the one they've finally let inside. The language of the avoidant personality is not straightforward. It is coded, defensive, and layered with unconscious They rarely say what they truly feel, not because they are deceptive, but because they themselves are unsure of what they're feeling. Their world is ruled by a deep conflict, a desire for intimacy that coexists with a fear of being engulfed by it. When an avoidant begins to utter phrases like, "I've never told anyone this before," or "I don't know why I'm telling you this," it signals a significant shift beneath the surface. These statements are not casual remarks. They are seismic indicators of internal movement. For someone who has spent much of their emotional life building walls, distrusting closeness, and preemptively pushing people away, such expressions are unconscious admissions that the fortress is no longer impenetrable. These phrases emerge not from the conscious mind, which is still likely trying to maintain distance, but from the unconscious self, what Jung referred to as the deeper layers of the psyche that hold our repressed truths and unresolved wounds. When the avoidant says these things, they are unknowingly revealing that a bond has been formed, that the person before them has become a mirror they can no longer ignore. The protective strategies that once felt like survival, emotional detachment, aloofness, intellectualizing their feelings, begin to feel inadequate, even false, in the presence of someone who does not threaten them, but sees them. The very act of confessing something they've never shared is their way of testing safety without realizing it. It's as if a child inside them is whispering, "Will you still accept me now that you've seen a piece of my truth?" In that moment, the person they're speaking to becomes more than just a companion. They become a vessel through which the avoidant confronts their own humanity. Trust is no longer an abstract ideal. It's alive and forming, slowly pushing through the cracks in their defenses. And though they may not fully understand the importance of what they just said, and may even retreat afterward out of fear, the truth remains that something irreversible has begun. The language of surrender doesn't always sound poetic or confident. It often arrives in fragmented, hesitant expressions that carry the weight of years of silence. If you hear these words, know that you haven't just broken through a wall. You've been allowed inside a world where few are ever invited. Avoidants do not fear love itself. They fear what love exposes. Vulnerability, to them, is not a bridge but a battlefield. It represents the loss of control, the risk of rejection, and the resurfacing of early emotional wounds they were never taught how to soothe. Their avoidance is not an arbitrary behavior, but a carefully cultivated defense system rooted in survival, often shaped by past emotional neglect or inconsistent caregiving. When such a person begins to express vulnerability, saying things like, "I missed you," "I was scared," or "I don't want to lose you," these words are not routine expressions, they are psychological earthquakes. Each phrase comes from a place their ego has fought hard to bury, a place where raw emotion lives, unguarded and unrehearsed. These moments are not simply emotional openings. They represent the collapse of an outdated internal architecture. The avoidant is stepping beyond the narrow limits of self-protection and entering a territory ruled not by fear, but by authenticity. This shift does not happen quickly or easily. It is often born from sustained exposure to emotional safety, where their defenses no longer serve them, and the cost of disconnection begins to outweigh the fear of closeness. Vulnerability for an avoidant is an act of psychological rebellion. It is the soul pushing back against the constraints of the conditioned self. When they reveal their emotional truth, no matter how briefly, they are surrendering the armor they've worn for years. They are risking being seen, not as the composed, distant figure they've projected, but as the uncertain, emotional being they've long hidden. These confessions are usually awkward, laced with discomfort or hesitation, because they mark a departure from the familiar. Yet in these very moments, the inner split between who they are and who they pretend to be begins to heal. The mask slips and the self begins to emerge. The act of revealing emotion is not just a connection to another person. It is a reconnection with themselves. It means their unconscious is daring to speak. Their shadow is stepping forward, and the person before them is no longer seen as a threat, but as a witness. Vulnerability is the seed of transformation because it shatters the illusion that they must be self-contained to be safe. When they allow someone to see their need, their fear, their longing, they are defying the internal narrative that love always leads to pain. In that space, they are not just learning how to love another, they are, perhaps for the first time, learning how to love themselves. This is not a weakness, but a profound inner evolution, and if you hear such admissions, you are witnessing something sacred, the soul breaking through the shell of avoidance to make contact with life again. When an avoidant tells you that you make them feel safe or that you've changed how they see things, it is not merely a compliment. It is a moment of deep psychological significance. These words are not offered lightly, nor are they spoken from the surface of their personality, which is typically guarded and dismissive. They emerge from a more hidden layer of the psyche, where the avoidant has begun to confront the limits of their old defenses. To acknowledge that someone has impacted them emotionally is to admit that they are no longer in control of the narrative they've tightly held, the one that says, closeness is dangerous and people cannot be trusted. It represents a subtle but powerful surrender of the ego's insistence on self-sufficiency. Most avoidants have spent their lives telling themselves a story in which independence equals safety and connection equals loss. For them to say that another person has made them feel safe is to betray that old story, to admit that intimacy can offer something other than pain. It also means that the emotional distance they once relied upon as protection is no longer serving them in the same way. This shift does not happen randomly. It occurs because, over time, the presence of another, patient, consistent, and non-intrusive, has provided a new mirror. The avoidant begins to see themselves not through the distorted lens of past wounds, but through the steady gaze of someone who doesn't demand, criticize, or abandon. And when they say, "You've changed," how they see things, they are recognizing, often for the first time, that their inner reality is not fixed. This is the beginning of the restructuring of the psyche. The avoidant has long clung to a rigid set of emotional beliefs as a way to navigate the world. Beliefs that were formed in pain and reinforced by repetition. But to acknowledge that you have altered their view is to recognize the presence of a force stronger than fear, trust. They are not just seeing you differently, they are seeing themselves differently. And this shift is not superficial, it is the root of true psychological transformation. Such admissions mean that the walls they built to protect themselves have become transparent, allowing light in for the first time. These statements are not strategic or manipulative. They are involuntary reflections of a psyche that is beginning to thaw. For the avoidant, saying that someone has made them feel safe is the same as saying, "You reached a part of me I didn't know still existed." It is the unconscious offering a fragile truth. in the hope that it won't be rejected. These are the words of someone standing on the edge of their former self, reaching toward the possibility of connection not as a trap, but as liberation. If you hear them, it means you have not just earned their affection, you have touched their soul. When an avoidant initiates emotional closeness, when they are the first to reach out, to ask how you feel, or to express their own emotions without being provoked, it is not just a relationship milestone, it is a profound inner event. Avoidants are not naturally wired for this kind of engagement. They have spent much of their lives withdrawing from such moments, convinced that intimacy is inherently threatening. For them to take the lead in creating closeness is to act in direct opposition to the habits that have long kept them emotionally safe. This gesture signals that something deeper is stirring beneath the surface of their well-guarded persona. It is not simply a sign that they feel affection. It is a symbol that they have begun to trust, not just the person before them, but the entire process of connection itself. When they start asking questions about how you feel, expressing concern for your needs, or confessing desires that draw you closer, it reveals that the inner narrative of avoidance is no longer holding absolute power. They are allowing themselves to become emotionally vulnerable, not because they've overcome all fear, but because the pull toward authenticity has become stronger than the push of defense. These moments are the clearest signs that their psyche is undergoing individuation, that mysterious inner process through which the self evolves by integrating what was once hidden or repressed. The avoidant's former identity, often built on distance and self-reliance, begins to dissolve in favor of a more balanced and human version of themselves, one that can hold both autonomy and connection without collapsing. This shift is rarely conscious. Often, they don't fully understand why they're reaching out or why it feels simultaneously terrifying and necessary. They may even feel uneasy afterward, unsure of what they've just done, as their ego tries to regain the familiar ground of emotional distance. But the act itself is irreversible. The door that opens inward never fully closes again. When an avoidant initiates closeness, they are stepping into a new self, one that honors emotion not as weakness, but as truth. This behavior marks a departure from the shadow-driven compulsion to escape love, and an approach toward the light of conscious relating. You are no longer someone they tolerate or keep at arm's length. You are someone whose presence invites their hidden self to emerge. It means that your consistency, your patience, and your emotional safety have reached into a place that even they were afraid to access. They are no longer running from the mirror. They are beginning to look into it, and what they see is not just you but themselves reflected back in a way they can finally begin to accept. And in doing so they choose not fear but transformation. When an avoidant says, "I hurt you and I see that now," or "It was my fault, not yours," it marks one of the rarest and most significant turning points in their psychological evolution. Such words are not casually offered, nor are they part of their usual emotional vocabulary, because avoidants often live in a state of detachment, not just from others, but from themselves. Their emotional withdrawal isn't only a protective mechanism against intimacy, it's also a way of avoiding shame, responsibility, and the vulnerability that comes from self-reflection. To admit fault, to take ownership of the pain they caused, means confronting the very parts of themselves they've long been unwilling or unable to face. It is the death of the persona, the carefully constructed identity that says, "I don't need anyone," or "I don't get affected," or "it's always someone else's issue." When they express remorse with sincerity, it's a moment where the unconscious breaks through the rigidity of the ego and forces recognition of their own emotional impact. For someone who has relied so heavily on rationalizing their behavior, deflecting blame, or subtly rewriting history to maintain distance. These statements represent the crumbling of a psychological wall that has stood for years. They are not merely admitting a mistake, they are facing their own shadow. This moment is powerful because it comes with the recognition that someone else's pain matters, and more importantly, that they were the cause of it. This kind of emotional accountability requires empathy, and empathy requires connection, which is precisely what the avoidant has long avoided. When they say these things, it means that the internal structures that kept them safe, denial, withdrawal, emotional minimization, are no longer as effective as they once were. It is a confession not just to another person, but to themselves. In that moment, they are no longer hiding behind intellectualizations or silent distance. They are allowing their emotional self to speak honestly, without armor. They are beginning to realize that love does not require perfection, only presence. This act of taking responsibility is not just about healing the other, it is about healing themselves. It is a kind of psychic rebirth, where the avoidant finally begins to see that they are not exempt from the emotional consequences of their actions, that intimacy demands a willingness to be seen, not only in strength, but also in failure. If they reach this point with you, you are no longer just someone they care about. You've become a mirror of their inner transformation, a witness to the moment their false self gives way to something more human, more whole. And in that moment of truth, even if it is brief, you are seeing the real person behind the mask, the one who has chosen to grow, to connect, and to become. To reach the moment when the avoidant speaks the words that reveal their inner world is to witness something sacred, a quiet miracle, born not from pressure or persuasion, but from safety, consistency, and presence. It is not a victory in the typical sense. You have not won them as a prize, nor have you forced them to change. Instead, you have become the mirror in which they finally felt safe enough to look. You have held space for their contradictions, their fear, their silence, and their longing, without demanding that they be anything other than human. And in return, they have allowed you to see what very few ever do, the soft center of a heart long hidden behind armor. When they say things like, "I missed you," "You make me feel safe," "That was my fault," or "I don't want to lose you," these are not mere words. They are seismic shifts in a psyche long frozen by the belief that closeness means pain and love means loss. These phrases emerge from the unconscious, often surprising even them, because the truth they have buried for so long is finally breaking through the walls they built to survive. This is not just about emotional openness. It is about rebirth. The avoidant has spent much of their life living in fear of being seen, of being dependent, of being vulnerable. But now, something inside them is choosing contact over avoidance, truth over safety, and love over isolation. And that change did not happen because they were convinced or corrected. It happened because, in your presence, they experienced something different. They discovered that love doesn't always wound, that not everyone leaves, and that they can show their truth and still be met with acceptance. In doing so, they began to challenge the very story their pain once wrote. You have not only become part of their healing, you have become a witness to their awakening. And perhaps the most powerful truth of all is this: the avoidant didn't just come closer to you, they came closer to themselves. Every time they reached out, took accountability, or opened their heart, they moved further away from the patterns that once imprisoned them and toward the wholeness that was always waiting beneath the fear. So if you find yourself in the rare position of hearing the words they'd never say to anyone else, know that you are standing on sacred ground. You have touched the hidden layers of a soul that once swore it would never be touched. You haven't just earned their love, you've earned their trust. And in the world of the avoidant, where trust is the rarest currency, that is the clearest sign that you have not only reached them, but that you have helped them reach themselves.